Okay, welcome everybody. Today is, let's see, September 23rd, Wednesday, our once a week meeting in English 203. We have a lot to cover today. We're going to talk about, as you can see here, fiction, elements of fiction, and specifically towards the end of this lecture, the last, say, 6 slides, or for you, probably last 20 minutes, we're going to talk about elements with fiction within Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, the novel that we're supposed to read. Hopefully you've gotten through at least half of it by today, so some of the concepts that I'm talking about make sense. Certainly you would have gotten through all of it by the time we have to do our in-class reading response number 2, which is next class. So look out for that email with instructions on that, but I'll go over that as a review at the end of this lecture. So plot, setting, character, conflict, symbolism, and point of view are the main elements that fiction writers use to develop a story and its theme. It's important to consider other elements, such as the author's use of imagery made available through typically the application of simile and metaphor. But since we've covered that in Elements of Poetry, we won't expand on it any further today. I'd instead refer you back to our Elements of Poetry document, as nearly all of those elements can apply in some shape or form to fiction too. Because literature is an art and not a science, it's impossible to specifically quantify any of these elements within any story or to guarantee that each will be present in any given story. Setting might be the most important element in one story and almost non-existent in another story. Just as a crime scene investigator cannot approach a crime scene looking for a specific clue, e.g. Shell casings, you as a reader cannot approach a story deciding to look for a specific element such as, say, symbolism. To do so would blind you to the other important elements present within the novel. Both the CSI team and you must examine the entire area carefully to determine what is present and how it is important. So your job in reading Slaughterhouse-Five, at least at this incremental point in the semester, is to be open to the idea that all these elements might pop out and you might be able to parse from the novel all these elements, or maybe just a few. Famed novelist Tom Clancy, he wrote Patriot Game and Clear and Present Danger. He came up with the character Jack Ryan, if you remember. He's noted as saying the difference between fiction and reality is that fiction has to make sense. Imagine that. Fiction has to make sense, he said, whereas reality, everyday life, doesn't. So it's incumbent upon the author to make sure his or her fiction uh, makes sense to the reader. There's no ambiguity unless it's intentional. So, in order to make fiction make sense, authors must utilize some or maybe even all of the following elements of fiction. Okay, first we get the elements of fiction to include plot. Most plots develop in 5 stages, as we can see here, both visually and through the bulletized points. First, exposition introduces the story's characters, setting, conflict. 2, the rising action occurs as complications, conflicts, or twists. It's where the intensification of the conflict, the problem, happens to the characters. So something's being done to these characters, either inside force or outside force, typically outside. Sometimes a mixture of both. 3, climax is the emotional high point of the story. And then we have after that, 4, the falling action. It's the logical result of the climax. It can't just keep climaxing and keep going up, right? You got to reach a paramount at some point, like we see here with the mountain. You got to reach the peak at some point, then fall over the other side. And then 5, the resolution presents the final outcome of the story, often called the denouement. What happened next in the story is what the denouement or the resolution tells us. Okay, plot continued. Within literature, the impression is sometimes given that plot is not important to the story or its readers. Uh, of course, plot is important, though. It was what got us interested in reading in the first place. It was the carrot on the string that pulls us through a story as we wanted to see what would happen next. That said, let me emphasize that a plot is not always the most important element of a good story. Recent fiction and film, for example, have de-emphasized plot, frequently stressing character or conflict, for example. The film, for example, for example, think of Pulp Fiction or The Joker, whereby the plot is a thin veil compared to the emphasis that is placed on the various characters in the film, how different they are, how unique they seem, and or how they are placed in extreme situations so that their state of mind and or actions are emphasized instead. In this way, think of plot as the hydraulics. It drives the story and its character or characters forward. The next is setting in terms of elements of fiction. Stories actually have 2 types of setting, physical and chronological. The physical setting is, of course, where the story takes place. The where can be very general, a small farming community, for example, or very specific, a two-story white frame house at 739 Hill Street in Scott City, Missouri. Likewise, the chronological setting, the when, can be equally general or specific. The author's choices are important. Shirley Jackson, a short story writer, gives virtually no clues as to where or when her story, The Lottery, is set. Examination suggests that she wants the story to be universal, not limited by time or space. So she was highly intentional. It was very methodical on her part to leave out and make it ambiguous where the actual town or village or city the lottery takes place in. Its setting. It's a physical setting. It's brick and mortar setting. It's geographical address setting, so that she can imbue a certain universality to the story. Next is character. What type of individuals are the main characters? Brave, cowardly, bored, obnoxious. If you tell me that the protagonist, the main character, is brave, you should be able to tell me where in the story you got that perception. Also, how does the protagonist react or doesn't react to the antagonist of the story? In literature, as in real life, we can evaluate characters three ways. One, what the individual says. Two, what the individual does. And three, what others say about him or her, all in the hopes of building the character, also called characterization. So as we read Slaughterhouse-Five, as we move on to read the other stories within this class, we have to bear in mind uh, about those three things in terms of character. How is the author building the character on the page, right? Not just giving us all the details at once about a character, right? That would be what's called an info dump, and we don't do that. Authors don't do that when they craft, either poetry or if they craft novel or creative nonfiction. You have to slowly, incrementally build the character for the reader. But they do that in these three ways. What did they say, what is said about them, and what is said to them. As there were two types of setting, uh, there are two types of conflict that are possible within creative writing within a novel. There's external and there's internal conflict. Some of this will be a review for many of you. External conflict could be man against nature, people in a small lifeboat on a rough ocean, for example, or a man against man against himself, conflicting against himself. Internal conflict is, as it suggests, a character struggling with an internal issue, an emotion like fear. And while it might not seem as exciting as external, remember that real life has far more internal conflicts than external conflicts. Film and fiction emphasize external conflict not simply because it's more interesting, but also because it's easier to write. In film script, uh, you merely have to write, quote, a 5-minute car chase follows, unquote, and you've filled 5 minutes. How long would it take to write 5 minutes worth of dialogue? Probably much longer. So that's why I think it's the film industry easily defaults to external conflict. Okay, the next, with regard to elements of fiction, is symbolism, how things are symbolic. Don't get bent out of shape about symbols. Simply put, a symbol is, as we discovered in looking at poetry, something that means something else. Frequently, it's a tangible slash physical thing that symbolizes something intangible. The basic point of a story or poem rarely depends solely on understanding a symbol. So, however important or interesting that might be, symbols are usually frosting on top of other elements in the hopes of adding interest or depth to the overarching cake of the story, right? It's normal for you to be skeptical about symbols. If I tell you that the tree is a certain story symbolizes the Garden of Eden, you might ask, is that really there, or did I make that up? Or how do you know what the author intended? Within literature, we might indeed overinterpret at times by finding symbols that really aren't there. But if you don't occasionally chase white rabbits that aren't necessarily there, you will rarely find the ones that are actually there. So look for a symbol. Look for it as you're reading. If it jumps out at you, um, take note. For example, in the film 2001: Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick and written by Stanley Kubrick, an amazing director, a computer named Hal is controlling a flight to Jupiter. When the human crew decides to abort the mission, Hal, programmed to guarantee the success of the mission, logically begins to kill off the humans. Science fiction's oldest theme, man develops a technology that he not only cannot control, but it controls him. Consider Hal's name as symbolism or symbolic of something else. Advance each letter in Hal by one letter in the alphabet. Change the H to I, the A to B, and the L to M. When you realize how close Hal is to IBM, international business machines, the first response is disbelief. But clearly the closeness of the names is either an absolute accident or an intentional choice. As much as we are startled by the latter, we probably agree that the odds against the former is being an accident are astronomical. Some person thought that up, or maybe a computer did. Either way, we have to decide if that is intended symbolism, or did it materialize organically, or did we introduce the symbolism through misinterpretation of the text? Okay, the next element of fiction is point of view, and we're going to have like 5 slides on this. Point of view is actually somewhat complicated and convoluted, but we're going to attempt to debunk it. Don't, just like symbolism, don't get wrapped around the axle on this. Don't overthink it. If you have any questions on point of view, just simply email me. But point of view, the point of view is that the narrative point of view, which chooses how the story is told. But more specifically, who tells it? There are 2 distinctly different types of point of view, and each of those 2 types has 2 variations. Let's take a look at each type of point of view. Okay, in the first person point of view, the story is told by a character within the story, and is a character using the first person pronoun I. I this, I did that, I went here, I went there, this happened to me. If the narrator is the main character, the point of view is first person protagonist. Mark Twain lets Huck Finn narrate his own story in this first person point of view. If the narrator is a secondary character, the point of view is first person observer. Author Sir Conan Doyle lets Sherlock Holmes' friend, Dr. Watson, tell the Sherlock Holmes story. We never really we don't get the direct point of view of Sherlock Holmes. It's always Watson talking about Sherlock Holmes, what Sherlock Holmes did, observing him, the first person observer. Doyle frequently gets credit for telling detective stories this way, but Edgar Allan Poe, the poet and short story writer, perfected the technique half a century earlier. In the third person point of view, the story is not told by a character, but by an invisible author using the third person pronoun, he, she, or it, to tell the story. I think most of us are familiar with this. Instead of Huck Finn speaking directly to us, my name's Huckleberry Finn, and telling us, I killed a pig and spread the blood around so people would think I'd been killed. The third person narrator would say, he killed a pig and spread the blood. Okay, continue with point of view. If the third person narrator gives us the thoughts of the characters, their internal thoughts, right? Then she, he is a third person omniscient, all knowing and seeing narrator. They can go inside any character and know their thoughts, their intentions, their wills, their wants, their desires. If the third person narrator only gives us information that can be recorded by a camera and microphone, no thoughts, then she, he is a third person dramatic narrator, sometimes called the third person limited. Okay, finishing up point of view. In summary then, here are the types of point of view. First person breaks down to have 2 parts, protagonist and observer. So first person protagonist narrator, first person observer narrator. And then third person has 2 parts as well. Third person omniscient narrator and third person dramatic or third person limited narrator. Different points of view can emphasize different things. A first person protagonist narrator would give us access to the thoughts of the main character. If the author doesn't want us to have that access, she, he could use the first person observer, for example, or the third person dramatic limited. The question is then, how close is the camera and why, we might ask ourselves. Okay, the next and actually the final element that we're going to mention for the elements of fiction is theme. And remember, not all stories or poems, or films for that matter, have an overriding universal theme that exists to the breadth of the narrative. So let's look at theme. Theme isn't so much an element of fiction as much as the result of the entire story. The theme is the main idea the writer of the poem or story wants the reader to understand and remember. One might conjure thoughts of moral in discussing theme, but it's not a good synonym because moral implies a positive meaning or idea, and not all themes are positive. One word, love, for example, may be a topic, but it cannot be a theme. A theme is a statement about a topic. So we could take love and extend that out to make it a theme. For example, the theme of the story is that love is the most important thing in the world. That's cliche, of course, but it is a theme. Okay, in light of all these elements of fiction, let's look at Kurt Vonnegut's novel, Slaughterhouse-Five. Okay, fiction, elements of fiction. We've breezed through that. I'm going to also attach that to the email that I send the link on, and I'll attach elements of fiction within Blackboard in a folder marked elements of fiction. Slaughterhouse-Five, or the full title, Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death. typically just reduced down to Slaughterhouse-Five as the main title. It's considered by many as an anti-war novel written by Kurt Vonnegut. Anti-war for a number of reasons. The main overarching reason is that it doesn't glorify war, but makes it look ugly and dark, and a flaw, a foible of humanity, of the human condition that we transgress through the act of war. And it was published in 1969. The absurdist, non-linear work blends science fiction with historical facts, notably Vonnegut's own experience as a prisoner of war in Dresden, Germany, during the Allied firebombing of the city in the early 1945. The novel is considered a modern-day classic. So it's both um, autobiographical because, in fact, Kurt Vonnegut was a POW in Dresden during the firebombing by the American Air Force, or it would be Army Air Corps back then. Um, where he believes some 100,000 people died. That's a lot of people. That would be more than the actual people that died from the impact of in Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atomic bomb. So it's both autobiographical and it's a work of fiction, and we could see that throughout. We're going to talk about this later in this lecture, but you can see that in chapter 1, he's talking directly towards us as Kurt Vonnegut, as the author, and then he sprinkles throughout the novel Kurt Vonnegut talking as the author of Slaughterhouse-Five, talking directly to us, the reader. So we'll parse that later on from the actual novel in this lecture. As a general overview, though, in the novel's opening chapter, Vonnegut mentions his time as a POW, as well as a return to Dresden after the war, years after the war. He also discusses the process of writing the novel and how he is a minor character in the work. The next chapter introduces Billy Pilgrim, who has become unstuck in time, moving throughout his life randomly. One of the major themes is time within this novel for sure. Um, and then it's not enough, as we said before, with love. It's not enough to say, oh, a major theme is love. But you got to expand it one step further. A major theme is time, and this is why, X, Y, and Z. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, one of the major themes, and even a driving force within the novel, is Billy Pilgrim become unstuck in time. This becoming unstuck in time is a highly intentional move on Vonnegut's part, as it allows us to seamlessly move through time via Pilgrim's flashbacks and flash forwards, which happens often within the novel. The novel has been described, and you can find this on the novel's second page, by Vonnegut himself as, quote, "This is a novel somewhat in the telegraphic, schizophrenic manner of tales of the planet Trofimodor, where the flying saucers come from." And he says peace for whatever reason, unquote. I would say that description is befitting, as the book, especially its tendency to jump around in time, can be seen as a schizophrenic treatment with regard to time. We'll talk more about the novel's treatment of time in a moment. Because Slaughterhouse-Five is blending autobiographical with that of science fiction, I think it's important to look at some background information, the biography of Kurt Vonnegut, as well as other things he's written. Kurt Vonnegut was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, on November 11th, 1922. So if you do the math, he's dead now. Vonnegut emerged as a novelist and essayist in the 1960s and penned the classics Cat's Cradle, great novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, and Breakfast of Champions, other great novel, before 1980. He is known for his satirical literary style, as well as the science fiction elements in much of his work. Vonnegut died in New York City on April 11, 2007. He was a heavy smoker. That contributed to his death. I believe he fell and hurt himself, and that was what ultimately killed him. But I think we talk about that in a moment. Born. Oh, sorry. I don't want to be redundant. After studying at Cornell University from 1940 to 1942, Kurt Vonnegut enlisted in the U.S. Army. He was sent by the Army to what is now Carnegie Mellon University to study engineering in 1943. The next year, he served in Europe and fought in the Battle of the Bulge. After this battle, Vonnegut was captured and became a prisoner of war. That POW we spoke about, that was so important as Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-Five. He was in Dresden, Germany during the Allied firebombing of the city and saw the complete devastation caused by it. Vonnegut himself escaped harm only because he, along with the other POWs, was working in an underground meat locker, that slaughterhouse, making vitamin supplements. Soon after his return from the war, Vonnegut married his high school girlfriend, Jane Marie Cox. The couple had 3 children. He worked several jobs before his writing career took off, including working in newspaper as a newspaper reporter, a teacher, and a public relations employee for General Electric. The Vonnegut's also adopted his sister's 3 children after her death in 1958. Okay. Showing Vonnegut's talent for satire, his first novel, Player Piano, took on corporate culture and was published in 1952. More novels followed, including The Sirens of Titan, 1959, Mother Night, 1961, and Cat's Cradle, 1963. War remained a reoccurring element in his work, and one of his best-known works, Slaughterhouse-Five, what we're reading within this class, draws some of its dramatic power from his own experience, the autobiographical parts that we spoke about. The main character, Billy Pilgrim, is a young soldier who becomes a prisoner of war and works in an underground meat locker, not unlike Vonnegut, but with a notable exception. Pilgrim begins to experience his life out of sequence and revisits different times repeatedly, that flashback and flash forward that we spoke about. He also has encounters with the Trophimodorians. So some people have problems with this pronunciation. I'll do it slowly. Trophimodorian. So Trophimodorians from Trophimodor. The exploration of the human condition mixed with the fantastical struck a chord with readers, giving Vonnegut his first best-selling novel. Despite his success, however, Vonnegut wrestled with his own personal demons. Having struggled with depression on and off for years, he attempted to take his own life in 1984. Whatever challenges he faced personally, Vonnegut became a literary icon with a devout following. He counted writers such as Joseph Heller, another World War II veteran, as his friend. He also suffered PTSD, and I think we see that come out within Slaughterhouse-Five, and we'll speak about that in a future class. His last novel was Timequake in 1997, which became a bestseller despite receiving mixed reviews. Probably became a bestseller because it was a well-known name, established name, Vonnegut, right? So Vonnegut chose to spend his later years working on nonfiction. His last book was A Man Without a Country, a collection of biographical essays. In it, he expressed his views on politics and art and shed more light on his own life. Vonnegut died, as we mentioned before, on April 11, 2007, at the age of 84, as a result of head injury sustained in a fall at his home in New York a few weeks earlier. He was survived by his second wife, photographer Jill Krementz, their adopted daughter Lily, and 6 children from his first marriage. Okay, why is all of Vonnegut's biography important? Well, I would say it's crucial to comprehending some of the dark themes of the novel. As we begin to understand the motives and past history of the novelist, of Vonnegut, then we can see part of Vonnegut emerge within the actual novel, which he does. Vonnegut, and this is highly unusual for fiction, is a character within his own novel. The author is a character. We can see this in the opening chapter where Vonnegut is talking directly to us. He says to us, all this happened more or less, unquote. Vonnegut, the author, is present from time to time, sprinkled throughout the novel. Take this passage from the novel, whereby Vonnegut is addressing us, the reader, as himself, as Kurt Vonnegut. Quote, an American near Billy wailed that he had excreted everything but his brains. Moments later, he said, there they go, there they go. He meant his brains. That was I. That was me. That was the author of this book. So it goes. Okay, let's talk about that ominous repetitive statement. So it goes that I ended the last slide with. Even if you only delved just into the first half of Slaughterhouse-Five, you would have undoubtedly noticed the repetition of the phrase, or what we call refrain, so it goes, permeating the breadth of Vonnegut's novel. This refrain is expressed by the novel's aliens, the Trophimodorians, by its central protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, but also echoed in the times we can actually see and even hear Kurt Vonnegut, the author, seemingly talking directly to us, the reader. So It Goes is written 106 times within the confines of Vonnegut's novel. So ultimately, the question becomes why? Why would there be such amplification on these 3 little words? What service was a small statement offering to the novel's meaning and ultimately our interpretation of the saying's central message? There are large questions to these are large questions to answer, but the general consensus is that So It Goes is in reference to death. Specifically, however, the line refers to the Trophimodorian concept of death, which, because the Trophimodorians can see, if you recall from the novel, all moments of time at once. They view the moment of death as only one of many moments in a given life. According to the novel, the aliens see all instances throughout their lives, what the narrator likens to viewing all of the Rocky Mountains at once, where you can see all the peaks and valleys holistically at the same time, right? The Trophimodorians choose to focus on the moments in which a person is alive, the peaks, and turn away from the moment in which a person is dead, the valleys, by saying, so it goes. In the novel, the line is used when anything or anyone dies, whether it's a tree, a dog, 1,000 people, as we see in the carpet bombing of Dresden, Germany. In one sense, the phrase criticizes the human indifference to death that occurs all around us, but it also calls attention to that indifference. By calling attention to human indifference to death, the phrase challenges the reader to overcome that indifference, Even as it emphasizes death as an inevitable part of existence. So it goes. Let me go ahead and read this passage and we'll talk about it. Uh, this is within Slaughterhouse-Five. Quote, I looked through the Gideon Bible in my hotel room for tales of great destruction. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar, I read. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire for the Lord out of heaven, from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities in all the pain, in all the inhabitants of the cities, and which grew upon the ground. So it goes. What's interesting here, too, is Vonnegut mentioning this passage from the Bible. It's as if he's recognizing, even throwing into sharp relief, uh, the idea for us, just how pervasive history as well as the Bible have woven into them violence and other transgressions. So death, Vonnegut seems to be saying, is universal and inevitable. Just like Thanos, I am inevitable. Okay, part of any English class or creative writing class or literature class is you're internally analyzing the text, and that's fine. Critical analysis of the text, where you're just parsing from it the elements of fiction or the elements of poetry and giving us examples and stating why you think this author would do this. But also there's the discipline of comparative literature, where you compare, say, what we're going to do here, say Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five to Black Aperture, Matt Rasmussen's Black Aperture. So let's go ahead and look at these two things. There's a poem within Matt Rasmussen's collection of poetry titled Reverse Suicide, if you remember it, whereby it's a beautiful poem, whereby the speaker of the poem is witnessing his brother unkilling himself, hence the title Reverse Suicide. The poem marries up very well to a similar scene within Slaughterhouse-Five, where the war effort is collapsing on itself, but in reverse, just like Matt Rasmussen's poem. I'll read both the poem, which is short, and also the passage from the novel, which is a bit longer, so we can see how the authorial techniques of scene reversal are highly similar, despite probably being highly unintentional on Rasmussen's part. First, the poem, Reverse Suicide. The guy Dad sold your car to comes back to get his money, leaves the car. With filthy rags, we rub it down until it doesn't shine, and wipe your blood into the seams of the seat. Each snowflake stirs before lifting into the sky as I learned you won't be dead. The unsuffering ends. When the mess of your head pulls together around a bullet in your mouth, you spit it into Dad's gun. Before arriving in the driveway, while the evening brightens, and we pour bag after bag of leaves on the lawn, waiting for them to leap onto their bare branches. Okay, so beautiful poem. If you look at it in terms of the images within it and what the description and actually what's taking place, is that his brother is becoming alive again. It's everything within the scene. It's almost like a movie scene where you see the bullet coming back out, him spitting into the gun. All his head and brain matters is becoming unified and coalescing back into its regular place on his head, right? And then leaves at the final scene, or jumping back and leaping back onto the branches. Um, so although it's beautiful, I think in terms of comparative literature, and it's macabre as well. In terms of comparative literature, I think it marries up, like I said before, to this scene, and it's kind of long from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. And this is just one giant quote. Billy looked at the clock on the gas stove. He had an hour to kill before the saucer came. He went into the living room, swinging the bottle like a dinner bell, turned on the television. He came slightly unstuck in time, saw the late movie backwards, then forwards again. It was a movie about American bombers in the Second World War and the gallant men who flew them. Seen backwards by Billy, the story went like this. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses took off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew at them backwards, sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen. They did the same for the wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over Germany that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes. They used them to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair. Over France, though, German fighters came up again, made everything and everybody as good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them into the ground, to hide them cleverly, so they could never hurt anybody ever again. The American flyers turned in their uniforms and became high school kids. And Hitler turned into a baby, Billy Pilgrim supposed. That wasn't in the movie. Billy was extrapolating. Everybody turned into a baby, and all humanity, without exception, conspired biologically to produce two perfect people named Adam and Eve, he supposed. Unquote. Okay. Wow, powerful imagery going on here. This reversal, just like we get in Rasmussen's poem, Reverse Suicide. So why did Vonnegut include this reversal of a war scene? Well, I would say, first, it's a beautiful description that we see here. But, and maybe even more importantly, it is furthering the trope that runs the breadth of this novel, and that is, of course, the treatment of time. Time, Vonnegut seems to be saying, is fluid and not necessarily set in stone, much in the way Pilgrim is not mired in the concrete of time, but traverses seamlessly through it. There was a dark humor at the passage's end, too, how everything reversed so far back in time that it somehow becomes Adam and Eve, these central characters. It's another Bible reference by Vonnegut. It's as if, in comparing humanity with all its flaws and ugliness and macabre dedication to this systematic violence of war, isn't it, in a dark, humorous sort of way, being distilled back to something pure, the notion of Adam and Eve, presumably before being exiled from paradise. We, it seems Vonnegut is saying, through our dedication to transgressions, especially through war, have been exiled from our own paradise. Okay, here we go. Final slide, final minute for you. It's a slide for me because I'm making a PowerPoint, then converting it to a YouTube video. So questions. As always, please email me if you have any questions or concerns or points of clarification. We got through Black Aperture. We're moving on to Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Please delve into it. It's an easy read. Look for the various elements of fiction. Let them jump out to you, hopefully. Write them down, and these are going to be the subject matter, hopefully, for your essays that you're going to write or reacting to what we have coming up. And that is our second, as you can see the second bullet here. Next Wednesday, September 30th, we'll have our second Blackboard discussion to respond to for Slaughterhouse-Five. I'll send instructions, as I always do, on how to do that on September 30th. So that morning, at some time before 1 o'clock, you'll get typically right around 10 o'clock in the morning, you'll get the instructions on how to log into Blackboard and actually respond in the discussion. I'll pose a question, and then we'll go from there. So everything seems to be going well. I think everybody's getting the handle of listening to these lectures, if there is a lecture that day. And I think with this class, we do have a lecture every day. And then, logging into Blackboard so we can do the in-class assignments that are on Blackboard with regard to discussion. And one poem and why, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so please reach out to me if you have any questions. If not, have a great Wednesday.